Okay, we're in this sermon series called Recovery Road, and we're coming to down toward the end. This is week 5. Next week is 6, and that'll end it with week 6. To get started today, I want to give us a little quiz, though, and this is going to offer us an amazing perspective, and I want to read this to you, and I want you to think about it. It's very revealing. The budget should be balanced. The treasury should be refilled. Public debt should be reduced. The arrogance of the officialdom should be tempered and controlled, and the assistance to foreign lands should be curtailed, lest become bankrupt. People must again learn to work instead of living on public assistance. Now, does anybody know what goes in that blank? Do you happen to know? Rome goes in that blank because that was written by Cicero in 55 BC. Does that just blow your mind or what? Huh? You see, there really is nothing new under the sun. Now, we started this series. We said the thing that got us into this, that got our national attention here and brought us into this was this financial crisis that we have. But we all agreed from the very beginning that the problem isn't a lack of finances. Our country has a spending problem, and our country has discipline problems. We have abused our prosperity. But just like individuals, nations don't really stop and reflect on realize that they have to change until things get tight financially. You know, finances are what actually focus us, cause us, force us to look at our problems. We're all like this. I mean, think about Obamacare, right? No one got upset 3 years ago. But now, as it's touching our pocketbooks, all of a sudden we have a crisis. No, we don't. Nothing's changed in 3 years. Not one word in that's changed in 3 years. But now, you see, because it affects our pocketbooks, now it's a crisis. You see, that forces us to look at it a different way. You know, I've known addicts across my years of my life, and oftentimes the thing that brings an addict to their knees is not the addiction. What brings an addict to their knees most of the times is they run out of money to pay for the habit. You see, the finance brought attention to the problem. And in the life of a nation, health problems and financial problems are pretty much the same thing. You know, normally what gets our attention is something that affects our health or something that affects our finances. And nationally, that's exactly the same thing. So today, what we're going to do is we're going to focus and talk specifically about the financial piece of our national recovery. Now, some of you have heard about the university, you know, the Financial Peace University that we just had a testimony about, or maybe Crown Financial Ministries, because both of these deal with managing our personal finances. Now, in their studies, their Bible studies, they ask the question, what does God have to say about finances? And through both of those courses, we learn God has a lot to say about our finances. For example, God identifies 2 different kinds of people in the world. There are those people who make interest, and there are those people who pay interest, for example. 2 different types. Now, what we have to decide is we have to decide which one of those 2 people we want to be. And then we need to reorder our financial affairs around that decision. Will we make interest or will we pay interest? I read another interesting testimony from a couple that's been married for about 30 years this last week. They decided that they were going to be ones who would not pay interest. First thing after their wedding, they enrolled in Crown Ministry class, and through that class made that decision. So they buckled down based upon that decision. And they started living in what they called crazy ways. And they adopted this overall strategy. We will give first, we will save second, and we will live on the rest. And they were totally committed. They were all in to that principle. So they agreed, first of all, that they would have no credit card debt. And then they set up their finances so that that would happen. And then they decided they would never borrow money to buy a car. And they never did. And the third thing they determined was that they would have a minimum of 30% down to buy a house. And they used that as a determining feature as to what house they would be able to buy. Now, they talked about these extreme measures that they followed together, but for all of those 30-some years that they've been married, they have been interest-free and financially secure. Now, that is pretty extreme, isn't it? And let's be honest with one another, there are some problems with that approach to finances. I'm going to list some of those problems for us. Here they are. Number one, you can't have everything you want. You see things that you want, and you really want them, but you can't have them. You have to look in the mirror and say, no. The husband says, sometimes your wife looks at you and says, no. And sometimes you have to look at your wife and you say, oh, I guess so, okay. No, you have to say no. He says, and it's really hard to look at your wife and say no sometimes. And you might hesitate recommending this to people because here's number two, you can't even have everything you can afford. And that's a particularly hard one this couple shared because they said they knew people that made similar amounts of money. In some cases, they knew people who made less money than they did, but they had much bigger houses because they were willing to put almost nothing down to buy the house. And they had better cars because they would lease them. And they had bigger cars because they would borrow money to buy them. And the lifestyle of many of their acquaintances was ahead of them because sometimes the couple made an agreement that they would not even get things they could afford. Third thing was you have to live on a budget. And I'm not even going to touch that one today, but it's there. It's an important thing. Fourth one, and this is probably the most un-American one of all of them. When the money runs out, you quit spending. Who would do that? You see, this is radical. But this couple decided that to live this way is what they were going to do from the beginning of their marriage, and they've just done that the whole time. Now the challenge is this, and there are many challenges in that, but the reason people don't do this is because we don't have to do this. I mean, the United States of America, this is so cool, and I need to slow down here and kind of as I go through this because this is kind of math, and I know how I get lost when people start talking about math, but because of the length of this, I really can't slow down, so stay with me. In our country, it's so cool with the credit lines and the credit cards and the home equity loans, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, what we can do is we can just get large sums of money loaned to us. I mean, it's incredible. We can even get credit earnings. Is that an oxymoron or what? Think of it. It's life-changing. I know that it sure changed the life of this country. I've watched it during my lifetime. And we all know this. I mean, we can actually reach into the future. It's a little bit like Back to the Future movie, it's magic. We can reach into our own future, grab a bunch of money, bring it right here into the present, and spend it right now. I mean, we can have it now. We don't have to be able to wait until we can afford it sometime in the future. It's so cool. We can have more. We can have better. We can have newer. We can have it quicker. We can have it right now. It's just absolutely amazing. But this couple said, oh, no. We're going to give all of that up in order to follow this crazy rule that we will pay no interest. And when you do that, when you make that agreement, when you live like that, then you're going to feel a little bit behind. And that's the couple admitted this. And so we felt like we're really behind a lot of our friends. And that's un-American, isn't it? To be behind like that. You will rarely meet people who will live like that on a consistent basis because our culture says, you don't have to do that. Go ahead. Reach into the future. Get your fistful of money, bring it into the moment, and spend it right now. Eat, drink, and be merry. And that system of using future money is great, as many of us know, for a while. But eventually, it catches up to us. And here's the difference. In the no-interest camp, our money can run out. But in the future money camp, our credit runs out, doesn't it? And before you know it, the minimum payment on the credit card is so large that it alone stretches our budget income. And then comes a hiccup, or then comes a bump along the way. Maybe we lose a job. Maybe the company downsizes. Maybe there's a catastrophe at the house. Maybe we max out our credit line, whatever. But you see, our spending habits are so ingrained, and that's why companies spend so much money on advertising people, this commercialization, right? It's not just about spending, it's about spending habits. And when we have those spending habits, when we bump up against this edge of credit, wow, we have a problem. It verifies these truths, all right? Number one, we cannot have everything we want at that point. It's a done deal. Number two, we have to go backwards at that point. We can't even have the things we once could afford. If you've ever had to go backwards financially, anybody? Raise your hand. You ever have to go backwards financially? You know, it's like ripping a scab off, isn't it? I mean, it's a painful thing. It's agonizing. There's so much social stigma involved in our lives. It's agonizing. It's depressing. It messes up your ego if you're a man. It's embarrassing to talk about if you're a woman. So, number three, the thing that happens to us is you are absolutely locked into a budget at that point. And number four, you have to quit spending on all unnecessary money. You don't have a choice any longer. And there's four more differences involved when you reach that bump and you don't have the resources to come about. Number one, paying no interest, you are able to say to yourself, no. But when you're using future money, someone else is telling you no. When you're paying no interest, the financial pressure is, how can I make more money so I can get that? But when you're using future money, the financial pressure is, how do I get enough money that I can pay for what I already have that I wish I hadn't purchased anyway? Number three, when you're paying no interest, we get to plan for the future. When we're using future money, we're always trying to clean up our past. And number four, when we're paying no interest and we hit a bump, we can just go into recovery mode and we can regroup. But when you're using future money and you hit a bump, you're already in recovery mode and now you're in a disaster. And hey, the reality is we have hit a bump in this country and we are in a disaster at the moment. Yes? Yeah, even our president has said, we're out of money. You see, we've hit a bump. Suddenly we realize as a nation we can't have everything that we want. Our president has said these words, we can't have it both ways. We can't have both things. We can't have a giant military and low taxes, $2 a gallon gas, entitlement spending, and everyone goes to college free. We just can't have everything we want. Even if we have everything we used to have, we can't even have that anymore. We can't afford that as a nation. And now we're in this current debacle. We can't even approve a budget, much less live on a budget. Now, for some of us average people, this whole discussion about whether we have a balanced budget or not is like baffling because, well, I mean, don't you have to balance a budget? I mean, we think, well, why would you have to have a law that says, you know, we're going to balance our budget? I mean, in our households, am I not right? In our households, we don't have an option, do we? I mean, ultimately, we must balance the budget, right? Am I right? Yeah. We have to quit spending when we don't have any more money. Now, I realize at a national level, when you have an economy that's extraordinarily complicated thing. But at the end of the day, there has to be something that governs spending regardless of how complicated things are. I mean, that just seems like a no-brainer to me. And when our money runs out, we have to quit spending. But our country's never done that, right? I mean, we'll just print more money and we'll go into deficit spending. We don't have enough money, but we'll just keep printing and borrowing money so we can keep on spending. And as a nation, we've now spent ourselves into a disaster. Now, here's something amazing, totally amazing. Our money actually has a warning label printed on it, to keep this very thing from happening. Not every nation has that warning label, but we have a warning label on the back of our money. Right there over the 1, it says, "In God we trust." It's a warning. It's amazing. It's also our national motto. And by the way, did you see this last week? Where a school in North Carolina refused to allow that motto to be posted in the classrooms. The Watauga County School District refused to allow members of the American Legion Post 130 to hang posters in school promoting the national motto because it might be unconstitutional according to the school's legal counsel. Are you kidding me? Really? "In God we trust," printed on all United States currency. Do you know what that means? It means we trust in God and not money. Do you know what else it means? In God we trust. You know what it means? It means that we trust what God says about this stuff is true. We believe that what God says about money is true. Think of it. Think of it. The very thing that has gotten us into trouble is printed on all of our money. That's crazy, isn't it? A warning. In God we trust. Oh yeah. Oh yeah. Jesus said you cannot serve both God and money. Trust God. Don't trust money. That's amazing, isn't it? I mean, God has had many things to say about money through the years, through scriptures, Old Testament, New Testament. I mean, the answer is in the book. What God has said about money, if we paid attention personally to that, we would all be secure. And if we had followed what the scriptures say about money nationally, as a nation, we would have already recovered. It's so revealing when we consider how God first began his first nation, Israel, with their economy. The first economy that he launched is profound. God took a group of people who had no laws, who had no rules, who had no culture. They had been in Egypt for 400 years as slaves. Slavery was the only thing they knew. And he freed Israel, and he puts them in their own piece of real estate, and he says, now, we're going to start from scratch. And from the very beginning, God spoke to them, the nation of Israel, about money and about finances, because God knew that at the end of the day, as the finances go, so the country, so the nation will go. Jesus said it this way, where your treasure is, where your money is, there your heart will be also. You know, wow, if we want to know where our heart is, look at the bank account. Look at the credit card statement. Don't look at your church membership, all due respect to being members of this church. You see, where our heart is, there our money will follow. And where our money is, there we'll find our heart. I want to read you a couple verses that deal specifically with what God said to Israel about borrowing and about lending. And imagine if we had maintained this perspective on our money as a nation. I mean, in the early part of our history, in this nation, we actually did believe and follow this. And here's what God says. He's making promises to the people of Israel as they're moving into the promised land, and Moses is speaking for God. He says, "The Lord will open the heavens, the storehouses of his bounty, to send rain on your land in season and to bless all of the work of your hands." And then he summarizes how good it's going to be. He says, "You will lend to many nations, but will borrow from none." Wow. You will lend and not borrow. He says the evidence of how things are going to be well for you as a nation is that you will have margin. You will have extra. And the surrounding nations will come to you to make loans, and you will make interest, but you will not as a nation have to pay interest. I'm going to bless you in this way so that you will be loaners of money and you will not be borrowers of money. Now listen, every good history student knows, and everyone in this room over 60 years old knows, that that is exactly where our nation was after World War II. Amen? We rebuilt multiple nations after World War II. Now here's the interesting thing about lack of debt. It used to be, in this country, an indication of wealth, lack of debt. In my early childhood, rich people didn't need debt. Middle class and lower middle class people didn't go into debt because debt was bad. It was bad. Debt was a bad thing because it was an indication that things were not going well for you. Debt was bad. And when our grandparents and parents were growing up, they didn't have credit cards. Upper class people paid cash. Middle class people maybe used layaway. Only the poor people would even consider resorting to debt. And now, get this. In my lifetime, our thinking individually and our thinking as a nation has completely changed. A 180-degree change. And you may know more about this than I do, but it has completely turned around. It's flipped. And now, here's the reality. And this should make us gasp. This should just suck the breath right out of us. It should just snuff the air right out of this room, but it doesn't. And that's a scary thing, you know. At this point, whether we are wealthy, the wealthier we are, the more like a poor person we act. Do you hear that? The wealthier we are, the more like a poor person we act. And let's put it this way. The wealthier we are, the more we owe. That's the way it is in this country, right? It's the new standard in this nation. The more money we have, the wealthier we are, the more money we owe. What used to be an indication that things were not going well now is standard fare. And in fact, the more money we control, the more wealth we have and control, the more debt we can leverage, and so the higher the debt load. And we live in a culture that says, look, why would you pay cash when you can make payments? Look at the rates. Look at the minimum payment. And everything's flipped upside down from the way it used to be. Debt is an indication now that you have great means because you have a lot of money that you can leverage to borrow from. And so you gain a huge debt. But such living has caught up to us individually and as a nation, and we're simply facing a disaster right now. Now, here is what is perhaps the most gut-wrenching, at least in my mind, the most gut-wrenching truth this morning. Why would God go on and on and on, make such a big deal about Israel being a nation that makes interest and not a nation that pays interest? It's because God knew something about debt that everybody learns sooner or later. I mean, we either learn it personally, the hard way, or maybe we watch somebody else struggle. But ultimately, we come to this conclusion. And the thing is, this is so tragic. I mean, listen, this has been in the Bible. Yes, that's the book for me. It's been in the Bible for over 2,000 2,000 years. I mean, this isn't new information. It's not like as if, hey, have you just read the latest? No, it's not like that. This has been available to us from the very beginning. In the book my grandparents learned to read from, but isn't allowed in schools or in business place anymore. Here's why God was over the top about the nation of Israel being a loaner, being a lender, rather than a borrower. Because the rich rule over the poor. I mean, it's always going to be the way. Rich rule over the poor. They're just going to rule over. Is that fair? Doesn't matter. That's irregardless, because it's reality. The rich will always have upper hand over the poor. And here's the parallel idea, because they come together. And the borrower, which used to be the poor person, is slave to the lender, which used to be the rich person. So God says to the nation Israel, and he says to me, and he's saying to you, look, when you owe, even if you owe on purpose, even if you signed up to owe, even if you wanted to owe, at the end of the day, you become a slave to the lender. Some of us are experiencing that right now, and we know the kind of attitude we have towards our owner, towards our lender, don't we? I mean, check me out on this. I think I'm right on target here, but we have a bad attitude about our owners, about our lenders. I mean, even if we say, Bank of America, I want to owe you money. When the bill comes, we don't say to our husband or our wife or our roommate, we don't say, oh good, I just can't wait to open that up. We don't say that, do we? We just kind of leave it sitting there because we know we don't like Bank of America. We don't like SunTrust. We don't like the credit union any more than we like the local loan shark. And it's our own fault. And you know why we kind of go about that? It's because when we're a slave, slaves resent the slave owner. That's just the way it is. I mean, when we are owned, our life is not our own. We don't get to tell ourselves no. Someone else is telling us no. And we're slaves. No one likes that. And listen, look at this. God rescued the people of Israel out of slavery. He loved the nation Israel. He said, I don't want you to be slaves. God's people are not supposed to be slaves. We're supposed to be free. And the truth of Christ sets us free. Now, even if we think owing money is going to be some kind of an advantage to us, at the end of the day, we are slaves to the lender. The borrower is always a slave to the lender. So it goes against what God wants in our lives. Now stay with me, because here's a despicable part of our history. And look, here's the reality this morning, okay? Truthfully. This sermon is going to go long again. And remember, we're following a sermon series that Andy Stanley used at his congregation, and we're kind of adapting that here. And what we're dealing with right here, what we're talking about, transcends time, because this is God's answer to our recovery in this nation. So stay with me here. We've got just a little bit more to go. Some 50 years ago, we started reversing our principles. We talked about that. And we started getting the upper and the middle class in debt with houses and cars and washing machines and gadgets and bank loans and credit cards. And as long as one could make the payment, everything was great. And so we got the upper class and the upper middle class and the middle class, and then we got the lower middle class. And before long, everyone's got credit cards. Right? And everybody has cars and houses and gadgets, and everyone's got all this stuff. And then we started running out of people to get into debt because everybody was already maxed out in debt. But since we're an economy that's generated, our economy is generated on our debt load. It's fueled by people signing up for debt. And you know this is true. I mean, every one of us in here knows this. Debt and interest is what rules this country's economy. Some really smart people at that point thought, hey, who else? Who else can we get in debt here? I mean, well, look, there's all these young and poor people. And we haven't gotten the young and poor in debt so much yet. So let's figure out a way to get the young people and the poor people in debt. Now, how do we get the young people? Well, we've already got some young people because they have those school debts, and they're going to be paying on those the rest of their lives, But how else can we do that? Well, he says the young and the poor, the young and the poor. And then they came up with this brilliant idea called a subprime loan. Now, most of you already know what a subprime loan is because it's offered at a rate which is above the prime rate, which means it's more expensive than the average loan. And it's directed at individuals who do not qualify for a prime loan rate. They do not have enough money, enough income to qualify to leverage a loan. What? I mean, do you hear this? Do you hear what we did? You see, these people were too poor to get into debt. What a reversal we've had here. And so they designed a way to make it possible for them to have them, so that everyone would have a chance to be in debt, rich and poor, young and old. And these young poor people, they should be able to get a house and have a car like everyone else. But they don't qualify for the normal loans because they're too risky, and so let's just charge the young and the poor more interest. And we can help them get something that they clearly can't afford. And that's because of this subprime loans, this brilliant scheme that we had. And at the end of the day, everybody in the whole nation was in debt. Woo-hoo! And then the music stopped. We know this. I mean, most experts agree that the final straw was the housing industry. And guess who suffered? Guess who is suffering the most in that? The young and the poor. Now get this, church, because we must face the truth of this. If we read even a slice of the Old Testament, we know what peeves God more than anything else is for smart, wealthy people to take advantage of the poor. God hates that. Hates it. He hates it. But in our effort to fuel this debt system of our nation, we got everybody in debt, and then the music stopped, and the whole thing came tumbling down, and the poor and the young are now suffering the most. And we should be ashamed of ourselves. I, and not you, should be ashamed. We, and not they, should be ashamed. Because this is about us, particularly about the people of God. We're in the most blessed, most prosperous nation in the world. And even then, we couldn't resist the temptation to reach into our future and get a handful of cash and bring it into our present and just spend it all. And this is why the world has such a bad attitude about our country. It's because of this American way that we've been living. And now the music has stopped. So is there hope? Well, here's the thing. Of course there is hope. And you know how I know there's hope? Because I know people. In fact, there are people in this room right now who know what it's like to have to sit down at a table alone, or sit down at a table with your parents, or sit down with your family and say, we are under a mountain of debt, but by godly principles, we are going to dig out, right? I mean, have you listened to the Dave Ramsey show on the radio and heard people who have called in and they shout, I'm debt-free. And they tell their story. And we know that at an individual level, at a family level, it is possible to face a mountain load of debt, deficit spending, high interest rates, maxed out credit cards, and a house and a car payment that's too high, and still recover from that. It is possible to dig out from that. Every person knows who's done that. It takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of sacrifice. It's not easy. You have to cancel stuff. You have to go backwards financially. You have to swallow your pride. You've got to get down and get dirty. You've got to claw your way out, but it's possible to do that. And by the way, if you're interested in joining Dave Ramsey's University Peace class, we're going to start one in this congregation right after the new year. And I realize Christmas is maybe the time when we need it the most, but you know, the reality is you've got to respect the church schedule. So after the first of the year, there's an opportunity for that. Smart people know this, that the shortest path to financial strength is generally the best path. The shortest path is the best path. In other words, you know, do whatever you have to do. You know, no sacrifice is not worth making. Give up cable TV. Give up the cell phone. Sell the boat or the jet ski or the timeshare. Stop your entertainment. I mean, one cannot start qualifying or making concessions when you're trying to dig out. You just put it all on the table and you decide, you know what? Whatever it takes, whatever I have to do, no messing around, you know, this is what we're going to, that's what it takes if you're going to dig out. Now the big question is though, how do we do that as a nation? I mean, individually, yeah, we see that. How do we do that as a nation? The answer is simple. It's just not easy. Truthfully. Simple, but not easy. Here it is. We've already talked about this. We have to get a bunch of Nehemiahs in the room together. People who will decide, you know what, we're not going to sacrifice this generation anymore for the sake of future generations. We are going to sacrifice this generation instead of sacrificing future generations. You've got to get a group of people in the room who don't care about re-election and who are not going to worry about blaming, whether it's this president or the president before him or the president before him. You know, not going to look and do that. We're not going to blame. What we're going to say is, you know what, we've all participated. We participated individually. We participated in being elected by promising people stuff that we had no business promising them. We're not going to blame anybody. We're just going to take responsibility for this ourselves. You would have a group of people that doesn't care, whether it's Republican or Democrats, who get the credit. And you realize that's a huge part of where we are today, you know, even in this disaster. Because we have too many people who refuse to give up party agendas for the sake and the well-being of the nation. We need a group of people who won't worry about what's fair, about being fair. They worry about resolving and solving the crisis. And then, once the crisis is solved, you decide what's fair and then make some adjustments. At the very beginning, we said it's we and not they. The recovery begins with me and not you. All right? It begins with we and not they. And at the end of the last 2 weeks, we've asked the question, what do all elected officials have in common? They are elected, which means it's really up to me and it's up to us. It comes down to how we vote. So here's a simple thing. To fix this problem, I want to tell you who to vote for. Let's follow the scripture that says whenever you borrow, you are a slave to the person or the institution or the group that you've borrowed from. So here's advice. Don't vote for anyone who promises that under no circumstances will they raise your taxes. Don't vote for that person. And don't vote for anyone who gives you an unqualified promise that, don't worry, I'm not going to do anything that will impact entitlement spending. Don't vote for that person. Vote for the person who will require something of us, speaking to us about sacrificing and speaking to us about going backwards in what we have now. Vote for a person who will require something of us and not promise something to us. In other words, let me put it a different way. Vote for a person who will look right into the camera and say, I promise that this is going to be a stormy and painful time. But recovery will be the rainbow at the end. That's the person to vote for. because everybody else is either uninformed or lying to us. Things are way too desperate for us to fall into the same old rhetoric. At the end of the day, we are one nation under God, and we all are responsible, and we've all got to buckle down, and we've all got to participate in the national we the people recovery. The bottom line for today is simply this, that recovery begins when we embrace the financial discipline required to become a nation that lends rather than a nation that borrows. And here's why that's so important, especially for us who are Christian. Because you know what? A nation or an individual that makes interest rather than pays interest is a nation or the individual who is best situated to continue in generosity. That is an individual or a nation who can be a giving individual or a nation. And that's exactly what God's intent is for us, that we would be giving, that we would be generous. And God tells us that a nation that is in debt is not a free nation to give. We're the most blessed nation in the world, and we should be the biggest blessing in the world. But we can never be the world's greatest blesser until we are in a place financially where we can extend God's blessings to the world. You see, it's not about us. It's not about our economy. This isn't just about the United States. Stewardship in our lives is about our use of resources, of blessings and wealth in order to pass on God's blessing to the rest of the world. And when we as individuals decide that enough is enough, we're not going to do this anymore. And when as a nation we decide enough is enough and we're not going to do this anymore, we'll recover. And when we recover, once again we'll be a nation that is in a place of an extraordinarily blessing to the world. But you see, it begins with me and it begins with us. If we will do what we need to do, what we know we need to do, if we'll vote the way we know we need to vote, then this nation will recover. And a bunch of us Christians, because there are so many Christians in this nation, a bunch of Christians will be the very first to give God the credit. Give God the credit, because it's His Word that shows us how we can recover, shows us the way out of this. Give God the credit, because God honors obedience, and God honors humility. And God will honor this nation if we'll live out the motto that's printed on our money, in God we trust. So let's become individuals that will make interest rather than pay interest. And let's be a nation that will make interest rather than pay interest, so that we'll be able to loan and to give rather than to be beholden to countries and outside influences that we borrow from. Let's no longer be slaves.